I'm Sean Aylmer, and this is a Fear and Greed extended interview. All the other good bits we couldn't fit into the daily podcast. If you're looking for the daily episode of Fear and Greed, check the podcast playlist. Otherwise, enjoy the interview. Last year, we were joined regularly by Ben Willey for a look at the advertising industry and the media industry more broadly. Ben is the General Manager and Media Director of Spinach Advertising Agency. Ben, welcome back to Fear and Greed. Did you have a nice summer?
G'day, Sean. We had a fantastic summer here in Victoria. It's great to be back.
Sure is. Now, look, let's start with the SMI data. The December figures came out not that long ago. First, what does SMI stand for, and what are the figures showing really for the full 2020?
Sure. SMI stands for Standard Media Index, and that's a measure of all of the money spent on advertising through advertising agencies. So depending on the category and the medium, we think it represents about 80% of the ad market in Australia. And it's been really a tale of different quarters. Obviously, in May, we saw the market back a disastrous 41.7%. And to see some growth again in October, albeit very small, at 0.4%, 13% in November, and then the month of December, 2%. So for the first time in over a year, we've seen 3 months of consistent growth in the advertising market. And I can tell you that advertising agencies are delighted to see the market coming back after what was potentially going to be a disaster.
Yeah. Where are people spending their money? What mediums?
It's a great question. And for the first time, we've seen digital media represent a higher proportion of television. So digital represents about 40% of the ad market and TV represents about 32%. Now, it's a bit misleading because the world has changed so much. And, do you consider catch-up television as digital media or do you consider that as traditional media? If I'm streaming last night's episode of Holy Moly or the tennis or something like that on my TV, it's classified as digital media, but the revenue actually goes mostly to the traditional TV companies. So the numbers are a bit misleading in that space. But what I think's really been interesting is that traditional television, excluding their digital component, has really outperformed the market. In the month of December, the market was up 2% and television was up 11%. So advertisers are starting to recognise the benefits of traditional TV and the value that it brings for long-term brand building.
So can we go into that a little bit? There's so much hype about digital advertising and digital media, yet if people are going back to television to some extent, what is it that television gives an advertiser that others don't, that digital doesn't?
Yeah, it's something we debate a lot in the industry. And what we've really learnt, there's a lot of really good quality research now that talks about the long-term and short-term benefits of advertising. And if you call it a funnel, at the very top of that funnel, you have long-term brand building effects, and they're for mass mediums like television and radio and outdoor. And, the advertising you do in those spaces doesn't have an instantaneous effect, but it tends to be more emotive and it tends to build your brand for the longer term. Now, the complete reverse of that is bottom of the funnel, and that'd be Google search ads. Now, they have virtually no brand building impact whatsoever, but their impact on your business is immediate because people tend to come in and buy straight away. So what advertisers and the whole industry have learnt is that there's this really unhelpful moronic debate led by certain people on LinkedIn who shout at you to say, only do new media and old media is dead. And it's a complete load of rubbish. Really, depending on the brief, there is almost always a role for mass mediums, for traditional mediums and what we would call long-term benefits, and there is a role for short-term benefits. And the most successful advertisers have a balance between those two, and they don't just flight towards digital media because it's new and shiny and trackable.
Okay, and so is that why places like Qantas and the banks and the retailers do use traditional media so much? Because it is a long-term play for them? Obviously, the retailers, for example, may have weekly price cuts, but overall, a lot of that marketing on television, at least, seems to be building relationships as much as anything else.
Yeah, look, you've hit the nail right on the head there, Sean. Smart advertisers that have sophisticated methods for tracking their advertising. And I'm talking about things like econometric modelling to really unpick the value of different channels, know that traditional media and know that broadcast television especially has a huge impact on brand. And when it's done well, it can have a huge impact on short and long-term sales. But most importantly, in a world that is really, really cluttered and really, really busy, television gives you the opportunity to own a share of a consumer's mind. And that's getting really, really hard in the ad business, to own just a tiny little speck of someone's mind. So when they get to the supermarket or when they go to buy something, they're familiar with your brand and they know something about what your brand stands for. And I would argue that radio is very similar. And you could say also that podcast advertising is very similar. We talk about radio as theatre of the mind, and that an advertiser gets you to construct something in your own mind. And because you participate in that advertising in your brain, it often forms much stronger connections and much stronger what we would call salience and awareness.
Stay with me, Ben. We'll be right back. I'm speaking to Ben Willey, General Manager and Media Director of Spinach Advertising Agency. The other thing I sometimes wonder about is because the ruling class are my age, rightly or wrongly, the 6 o'clock news, what Neil Mitchell's saying on 3AW or Ray Hadley on 2GB are saying, what the newspapers have, what particularly niche publications like the Fin Review. So in a sense, those sorts of, I think that sometimes the ruling class, for want of a better phrase, actually are watching that, looking at that, and it really matters to them what they say, perhaps more than the general public's, what's going on in TikTok.
Yeah, I haven't heard that expression, the ruling class. That's a great one. Well, what we see increasingly is traditional media sets the agenda for what is the news cycle, and they set the agenda for what happens on social media, on other mediums all around the country, really. So if the Neil Mitchells or the Ray Hadleys or the editors of The Age or The Australian, the Sydney Morning Herald, those sorts of papers decide that something is topical, well then, a lot of the chatter that follows that and a lot of the noise is set by those people.
Interesting. Now, a few other things before you go. The News Media Bargaining Code, we spoke about that a few times last year. It's come a long way, and apparently Google and the Prime Minister have spoken, and Microsoft said it's happy to offer its search engine Bing to replace Google if they'd happen to move out. Recently, the European Parliament said it's looking at the Australian code to see what happens there. What's the state of play on that one?
Oh, wow. Geez, you've got to get up earlier than Sean Aylmer to follow everything that's going on in this
That's
space.
pretty early, I've got to tell you. That is pretty early.
But look, just for those who haven't heard what it is, the federal government through the ACCC are trying to regulate big tech companies, and that regulation falls under a lot of things, but mostly they're asking those companies to pay for news content that is shared on their platforms. We've seen all sorts of megaphone diplomacy, we've seen threats, Senate inquiries, all sorts of stuff. My opinion is that there's a very, very long way for this to play out, and I don't think we're any closer to an agreement. All the rest of the media is hugely regulated, yet as we've talked about earlier, we've got approximately 40% of ad revenue going to businesses that have virtually no regulation whatsoever. Now, I'm not sure I agree that they should pay old media for news, but look, that's the decision the government's made. But I definitely agree that there should be some regulation in this space. So what we're going to see, in my humble opinion, is we're going to see a lot more megaphone diplomacy. We're going to see a lot more threats. The threats are entirely idle and saber-rattling. I promise you there is not a snowball's chance in hell that a business like Google that writes $4.3 billion in revenue in Australia is going to walk away from this market. It's just not going to happen. So there's a lot to play out. The thing that's really interesting for me is that Google especially have really ramped up what we would call their owned media. They reach a huge proportion of the Australian population on a daily basis, over half. Now, they have the opportunity to try and create some will within the community that can then turn into political will. So at the moment, you'll notice when you go on the search bar on Google, there's a pop-up and it tells you to talk about this code. And when you go on YouTube, there's an ad that they're running. So what I think we're going to see is we're going to see them become far more aggressive using their owned media to try and sway opinion in their favour. And if they can sway opinion in their favour, hopefully they can sway a bit of political opinion, and maybe the pollies won't be so aggressive when they sit down to legislate the final rules around this code.
We'll be back with more in a minute. My guest this morning is General Manager and Media Director of Spinach Advertising Agency, Ben Willey. I also just want to mention the tennis. That was delayed for 2 weeks. Channel 9 has the rights to it. How important is that, or how important is the delay, I suppose?
Well, it's fascinating for people who started their career buying ads on telly, like myself, because TV stations have a lot of momentum, and weirdly, TV stations are their own biggest clients. So for a company like Nine to have a program like the tennis, when there's not much else on, they can use that to then promote their other shows. And they promote that ratings juggernaut, love it or hate it, Married at First Sight, of which I'm a massive fan of. And they use the tennis really, really well to promote that show. Now, what's happened in 2021 is the tennis has started 2 weeks later. So it's given both 10 and 7 an opportunity to generate a bit of momentum. And we've seen both networks do pretty well in that period. 10 with I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here and The Amazing Race, and 7 with Holy Moly. So it's still very early days yet, and it's too early to tell. But both of those vehicles have been a great opportunity for 7 and 10 to promote their schedule and maybe, just maybe, steal a bit of audience from what is an absolute ratings juggernaut of crazy Instagram freaks throwing glasses of wine all over each other and entertaining the hell out of the middle classes of Australia.
And just before we go, Stan took on the sporting rights for rugby and Wimbledon. It's an interesting buy, that streaming services buying sports.
Oh, I think it's a really great move for Stan, and they're in the unique position of being owned by the Nine network. So they can buy the rights to sport, and then they can decide which of that sport they put behind the paywall and which of that sport they put on their TV channels. So Stan's competitors don't necessarily have that luxury. And shortly after Stan agreed to buy the rights to rugby in Wimbledon, what we saw was Amazon Prime do a deal to broadcast some swimming. Now, if you're a sports rights holder, this is fantastic news, because previously you had 3, maybe 4 television companies bidding for your rights to your event. Now you've got those TV companies and you've also got streaming companies. And the more bidders, like an auction in the outer suburbs of Melbourne, more bidders drives up the price. So sports rights holders will be very happy about this, and I suspect that we'll see the streaming services and also Google and Facebook being courted. And television stations will be quite nervous because they're already paying eye-watering numbers for sports rights. And if this pushes the price up even more, it makes it very difficult for small Australian media companies to compete with big global streaming services who've got incredibly deep pockets and weirdly, for some reason, don't have to make a profit.
Crazy. Ben, you're in for a very, very exciting year, I suspect.
Oh, look, it's going to be fantastic. Strap yourself in for the ride.
Ben, thanks for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thanks for having me.
That was Ben Willey, General Manager and Media Director of Spinach Advertising Agency.